4 o'clock. I am Deborah Walters. I'm the coordinator of the History Lecture Series. We're in our 3rd year. We're about to wrap up this year's final edition of the History Lecture Series. And we're ending on a really high note. I want you all to know. The young man in the back is going to be passing out some papers. We don't have enough for the entire crowd, so if you can kind of take one and share it with your neighbor, or 2 papers, it's going to become important during the presentation. Again, we have been doing this for a number of years. We've brought speakers from on this campus, around the community, from all areas. We have to have we're the history honors group on campus, so we have a history thread running through everything. And this time we have been really blessed with Cortlandt Barnes. Many of you might remember Cortlandt last year. He came to this campus in this very room about a year ago and spoke to us on his time as a guest of the Iranian government. So he will not be speaking to us on that topic today. So I wanted to kind of set that straight. He's going to be talking to us, as you've seen the posters around campus, on codes and ciphers. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce Cortlandt Barnes. I'm going to turn it over to him. Thank you.
Good afternoon. I think that I need to make a disclaimer here to begin with. I'm not a mathematician nor a computer scientist, and my interest in codes and ciphers goes back to my work with the CIA as a communications officer, and I'm intrigued by solving puzzles, seeing how things work or don't work, but more importantly, I'm interested in historically the relevance of why certain systems and certain abilities, capabilities, seem to work and others don't. And that's what I'm going to try and focus on. This first slide, if you look at it, it shows a swirling scroll at the bottom. That's an actual sculpture in the courtyard of the CIA between the old headquarters building and the new building. And it's called Kryptos, which in Greek means hidden. And it's got 4 messages in it, and to date it was created by the head of the cryptographic center at CIA, Ed Scheit, and James Sanborn was the sculptor. It was installed in 1990. It has 4 messages. Today 3 of those messages have been solved. The 4th message after 20 years still hasn't been solved, and Mr. Sanborn said he thought it would be done a lot sooner than this, and he gave out a clue to help people along. The last 6 letters of the cipher text, I think are HVLTT or something of that nature, and he said those letters decipher into the word Berlin. Well, but the 2 T's kind of negate the fact that it's a pure substitution, alphabetic substitution. So you have to try and figure that out. And if you're interested in that, if you're a mathematics major or a computer science major, because it was the first, outside of the CIA, the first person to break the first 3 messages was a computer scientist in California. Excuse me. And so if you're interested in that, you can Google Kryptos or CIA Kryptos and get a copy of the message and see if you can break it. And initially the rumor was, when they first put the scroll in, was that there was a reward for solving the puzzle. I found out there's no reward. It's just your own satisfaction that you've been able to decipher it. So my next slides, I'm going to talk a little bit about the difference between a code and a cipher. A code is a word or a phrase or a sign that's been given another definition to mean something entirely different. Like the forecast is for rain might mean I need to order more ammunition. But it's not a one-for-one substitution, alphabetic substitution, it's a code. A cipher is a substitution where you substitute a letter of an alphabet for another letter of an alphabet. And it's done best pseudo-randomly, or random. Well, random would be best, but we don't have no way of creating randomness with machines. However, we did try once. We monitored the skies like the SETI people do for the search for extraterrestrial intelligence, and copied that noise and converted the noise into alphabetic characters to create a random pattern. And it almost is random, because you can't, the noise never repeats itself, or repeats itself so infrequently that it appears to be random. So what I plan on talking to you about are some of the things that I've been interested in how you protect your own information and how you exploit the enemy's information. Historically, the reason for codes and ciphers, initially codes, was to communicate securely and prevent the enemy from knowing what you're saying. Early practices included memorization, deception. Say you went as you traveled with a message that you'd memorized as somebody other than a native or resident of the area you were from. Excuse me. Later practices included shaving the messenger's head, tattooing the message on his head, letting his hair grow out, and then sending him across the lines. Now he or she may not have known what that message said, but the only thing they knew was that it was on their scalp, and they had to save their scalp. So it was a very time-consuming effort. As alphabets emerged, ciphers became more important and widespread. Some of the initial uses of this, it's called the Caesar cipher, is if you always substitute the letter A with a 3-letter offset and it's always D, then you come up with a cipher code or a cipher that is not readily recognizable. But in the English language, we used, to combat those kind of systems, we used what we called frequency tables. It has nothing to do with radios or anything, but it's the number of times the letter E or T or S shows up in any string of a cipher message, because the letter E is the most prevalent in the English language, and I think T and S are the next two. So if you could find a prevalence of like the letter D or 2 Ds together, it might lead you to be able to decipher that monoalphabetic message, because they always were the same letters. So you'd have to, once you broke or thought you broke a couple of letters, then you'd have to start substituting words to see if they fit. And then once you did that, then that would broaden the number of letters that you understood, and that would help you go on more, and you would just unravel the message. Excuse me. I also want to say that if any of you have any questions whatsoever, raise your hand while I'm talking, and I'll break to answer it, because we may be done in about 10 minutes. Another substitute, monoalphabetic substitute cipher is called the @bash cipher, and it's just where an A is a Z and a B is a Y, and you just reverse the alphabet. And again, frequency codes defeat that very easily, or frequency tables. The next evolution, and I'm going to dwell on this a little bit, was the use of polyalphabet ciphers such as the Versionnaire square. Versionnaire square, which was one of the handouts, the little black matrix, is not a cipher. It's a conversion table. What it allows you to do, and the other sheet is a cheat sheet for doing triads so that you don't wear your neck out trying to figure out what's what. But for example, if you look at the cheat sheet with all the 3-letter characters on it, if your cipher text, if your plain text is A, and the next, and your cipher, or I'm getting confused here. You have your key text is A, and then the next row would be your plain text. If that's a Z, then according to the Versionnaire square, the next letter has to be an A. Now, after you do this for about a week or two, you don't even have to look at the Versionnaire square to find out what those conversions are, because you can do it in your head. You've already memorized all of the 3-letter symbols, or 3-letter codes. Oh, thank you. So it's a polyalphabetic system because it uses 3 alphabets. It has the key text, and then the plain text, and the resulting alphabet is the ciphertext. I don't know how well you can see that. This is an exact copy of what we used at the CIA for doing the conversion table. Now, this is not classified by itself, but given the input that creates the key text that uses this conversion table, that becomes classified. So there's several different ways to do your key text, and one of the ways is that the auto key and running key are two different ways to do it. Initially, Vigenère square was easily defeated because it also resulted in being able to be broken with a key frequency table, because what they would do is they would write their key text as all dogs go to heaven, and just repeat that until for as many times as they needed to, and that would be the key text. And then below that you would write your plain text English or Western alphabet message, and then the resulting ciphertext would be AZA or whatever it happens to be, and that fell prey to frequency tables because it didn't have enough randomness in the key text to guarantee that there were no quick repetitions of the characters. So they came up with another one they called running key. The running key, I take that back. The second one was auto key. First one was just a phrase. The second one was auto key, and what they would do at the beginning of their plain text message is they would write the word zebra, or any word you wanted, and that would offset everything. But again, it didn't stop the pattern from showing up to create that could be broken with the use of a frequency table. It was time consuming, and you had to have a lot of patience to do it. But once you knew that they were using the Vigenère square, the enemy or opposition was using the Vigenère square to create the triad and the resulting ciphertext, then you also knew what the three letters could be, and you could go backwards to get back at the plain text, to convert the ciphertext to plain text. The next one was called a running key. The running key the Germans used in World War II, using the Vigenère square. And what they did is they would have a book, like Gone with the Wind, would be available to the POWs in the camp. And the Germans had that book in Germany. And what they would do is say, okay, if you can get this book, or any one of these books, tell us in your date what chapter you're starting on in that book. So, of course, the receiving guys had to figure out which book it was, but once they got to the chapter, they would be able to break it immediately because it would start on the first sentence of that chapter. These were very, very good for the Germans to be able to communicate from the POW camps or anybody else because the books are readily available. The problem was the Canadians realized that the Germans were identifying the chapter of the book by using Roman numerals and the date. And it took them about 6 months to figure out that why are these guys using Roman numerals instead of Arabic numerals to identify the date. And they finally, I guess they did a little brainstorming, they figured out that this one book has been out of the library an awful lot. And so they figured out, and I don't know what the book was, but let's just say it was Gone with the Wind. That was being used as the key text for the message. And then they would write their message, and then they'd do the triadding using the Vigenère square, which they had memorized. They didn't have to have one of these. Or you could, if you knew it, you can make one up. It's not very difficult to do. And they were enciphering their messages and sending them out as, we call it secret writing or more or less invisible, MLI. What they would do is they would write their message with a stub, with a pencil with no lead in it, And what it would do is the ciphertext would show up on a blank piece of paper that was underneath the message that they wrote, and they would then write a message on top of the blank piece of paper. And when they got back to Germany, the Germans would take this paper and put something very fine powder like fingerprint powder on it and shake it around, and they could see the indentations in the paper, read the ciphertext, and then go to the book and resolve the plain text. It took a while for the Allies to figure that out, and the Germans were very much prepared to be POWs and have to do this kind of communication. You wouldn't do this kind of communication if you were in a combat unit or on a submarine or a surface ship, because there's no reason to. The best and most secure way to communicate is using one-time key. And I alluded to that with the space noise. One-time key is more secure. It's a little laborious because you have to do it one letter at a time. And in today's world, that's why they don't do this very much anymore, is that you can't send the volume of information that you need. But with one-time key, the other part of this that makes it difficult to do is if you have a one-time key pad, which is a bunch of 5-letter groups, 10 groups across, 10 lines down, on many, many pages, all of them random or pseudo-random, you have to give the person you're sending that message to that exact same copy of that book. So there's only what they call 2 registrations of it. One is the sender and one is the receiver. It's hard to put those in place unless you have a safe way to do it and you don't want anybody to intercept it. So it makes it very difficult, but it is the most secure way to do communications. And that's why, I mean, the real reason they don't do it anymore, or rarely, is because it's just too cumbersome. Okay, I went over that one. The next generation of cipher machines were automatic or electric cipher machines, and what they would do is they used mathematic algorithms to create a pseudo-random code that was then merged with, like a teletype machine output would merge with this code, and it would send out a pseudo-random stream. Now, the best that you can do with that is that you hope that you've protected your information as good as you can, because the opposition's not going to tell you they're reading your mail. You have to make it as secure as you can and keep it as close to your vest as you can, so that the opposition never finds out that that's, that you have this system. And likewise, if they're intercepting it and exploiting it successfully, they don't want anybody to know that they're doing that. So both sides are very, hush-hush about that. And that's why the National Security Agency exists, because that's their major function, is to protect our communications. They do a lot of other stuff too. One of the earliest of these machine cipher machines was Enigma. And this is one of my passions, so we'll spend a little bit of time on this. Enigma was created around 1920-21 in Germany, after World War I, obviously, to create a secure way for commercial enterprises to communicate with each other without being exploited by, commercially exploited by anybody else. So it was to stop industrial espionage. The Poles found out that Enigma was being used by the Germans, and they went to Germany, and the company's name was Enigma, so it wasn't very difficult to find them. And they bought some commercial devices, and they tried to break the German codes, army codes, with the commercial devices, and it didn't work, because the German army had gone, when they bought the Enigmas, they enhanced them so that they didn't work the same way as the commercial devices worked. But the Poles were pretty persevering, and they decided that they were going to try and figure out how the Enigma worked, and they eventually did. There was 3 scientists who worked on it, and I couldn't tell you, if I knew how to spell their names, I couldn't tell you how to pronounce it, but as early as the late 1920s, early 1930s, they were able to recreate the Enigma. And the problem they had was, even with the machine, they had to figure out the code. So they, much unknown to the rest of the Western world, created an analog computer called the Bombe, B-O-M-B-E. And they found out that they could, by using the messages that they intercepted, load that data into the bomb and let it crunch the numbers for a while, they could come out and fairly accurately determine the code variable for that day. But by the time they got the code variable, the day had already gone over and a new code had been installed, so they could go back and read yesterday's news, but not today's news. They enhanced that. First it took 2 to 10 days or 2 to 6 days, something on that order, to get the variables so that they could decipher the messages. They enhanced that so that they were getting the variables down to about 2 hours, but they had to gang a number of these analog computers together that would result in a quicker acquisition of the suspected daily variable. And they did that. The Germans attacked them about 2 weeks after they sold or gave, and I'm not sure whether they sold them or gave them, Bletchley Park, which was the big British intercept site in England, 2 of the bombas to use to exploit the Germans as well. And the British even enhanced the bomba even more with Alan Turing and a fellow named Knox. Knox did it Turing was a professional. He was a mathematician from Cambridge. He was recruited right away because of his reputation. He went to Bletchley Park, which they called the Government Code and something school, GCCS. Anyway, they recruited him to go to Bletchley Park, where they were working on how to break all these codes. And he was working on how to improve the Bomba, and they built many of them so that they could gang more together and get the data faster. A fellow named Knox, who was a traffic analyst, was interested in codes. Now, a traffic analyst only says this message went from this point to this point, had this many groups in it, and it was this kind of a important message. It was either like a priority or a routine or a flash, something that meant that it was, but they didn't do anything other than to say this unit sent this message to this unit, it had this much content, and it was this important. And that's basically what a traffic analyst would do. I'm simplifying it, but they didn't get into the content or internals of the message, whereas Alan Turing did. Knox was so interested in being a crossword puzzle worker and just a problem solver. In his own time, he started to work on trying to figure out the codes. And in fact, he was a big contributor to the Alan Turing effort to enhance the bomb so that they could get the information quicker. So Enigma was broken and exploited by the Allies against the Wehrmacht and the Luftwaffe of Germany for most of the war. The one thing that analysis and brute force attacks did not do was break the German Navy code. The German Navy code, and it wasn't anything to do with, they did use different codes, but they used the exact same machine, which had the same input-output requirements. What the Germans did was that their Navy radiomen were more precise in what they did. And I imagine that if you're under air attack by the Soviets or the Allies, and you're sitting there in this little foxhole trying to send a message on Enigma, you're going to make some mistakes, because your skin's on the line. The Navy guys didn't, because typically they didn't send their messages when they were in an attack mode. They would surface when they found a convoy. They would surface and send a message back saying, "We're here. There's this many ships in a convoy. Send more boats," or something like that. And Germans would do that, but they didn't make very many mistakes based on the pressure of their situation. And so it was difficult for Bletchley Park to figure out the codes they were using. Eventually, the Allies captured 2 U-boats. They captured one, but all they got was the rotors, and they didn't get an Enigma device. And then they captured 2 U-boats within about a 9-month period, and they got the Enigma machines and the codes. And about 9 months later, when the Brits figured out how to use the codes and decipher the messages and not alert the Germans that they were reading their mail, they started rerouting their convoys. Well, Admiral Dönitz didn't become a fleet admiral by being dumb, so he sent one of his, he realized they weren't able to find the convoys any longer on their normal routes or their proposed routes. So he sent one of his staff to the Cryptographic Institute in Berlin, and of course they said there's nothing wrong with Enigma. It's, you know, every keystroke is 1 in 150 million options. So how can anybody read this? When in fact, the keystrokes didn't have anything to do with it. The Allies had the codes already, and so they were using them. So Dönitz, when they got back and said there's nothing wrong with Enigma, Admiral Dönitz said, then we need to do something because something strange is going on. And he changed all the codes, all the submarine codes for the Enigma. Well, Bletchley Park went dark, and the convoys didn't know where the wolf packs were, so they couldn't avoid them any longer, and they started having more success. Dönitz decided that just changing the codes more frequently didn't have the desired effect, so he had the Navy Enigma machine add 1 more rotor to it. It had 3 thumb wheel rotors to set the daily variable. He added another thumb wheel rotor to have a 4th variable, which made it, Bletchley Park went dark again. I mean, they never recovered from the Dönitz countermeasures to their capture in the Enigma machines and the codes. A little later, the Allies captured 2 more U-boats with the 4 rotor units and the code books, and of course the Germans never knew this. In fact, it was a long time before they realized that 5 of their submarines had been exploited for the Enigma and the codes. And when they got those newer machines, they were able to exploit them again. And the wolf packs, when they went out, sorted out to go after a convoy, were pounced upon because the Allies knew they were coming. So that's my story of Enigma. There may be other versions of it, but that's as I understand it. The Americans invented a cryptographic device. Oh, I have to go back. One of the issues with Enigma was that it didn't have enough variables to prevent a pattern over time. So the more messages that Bletchley Park was able to intercept and try to decipher, the more they were able to see certain patterns show up, which helped them in their cryptanalysis effort. The American device was invented about 10 years later by a couple of Army majors, and it was called the Army called it Sagaba. The Navy called it, excuse me, the Electric Cipher Machine Mark II. And it was a lot different from Enigma. Enigma had initially 3 thumb wheels for variables and went to 4. The American machine has 15 rotors. 10 of the, well, every one of them can be set as a thumb wheel. You can set it every day, or every message is what they did. It had like, let me see. That's the Enigma with the 3 rotors, and this is the ECM Mark II. There's 5 rotors in the back, 5 wheels in the front, and these are big, I forget what it was called, but anyway, they're like black plastic rotors that could be set. Each one was set as a variable. One of these was set as a message indicator for a message indicator. Every time they got a message, the first 2 groups of an American message had a 5-letter group that was the system indicator and a 5-letter group that was a message indicator. Prior to that, under the front plate here are 5 numeric wheels. Each one of these rotors is the full alphabet. In front of that are 5 index wheels that are 0 through 9. And every day they had a daily variable. They would set the front 5 only once. So that was the daily variable, and everybody in the Navy set it at the same time every day. The other variables were set every time a message came in, and all messages in World War II to the American fleet, at least in the Pacific, and I think in the Atlantic as well, were done over Morse code. They didn't use radio teletype or anything. Everything was some radioman sitting there listening to dits and dahs for hours on end. And I've talked to one of the radiomen on the USS North Carolina, and I said I was pretty proud about how fast I could copy code, and he said, oh, we did 35 to 40 words a minute. It's like, that's a buzz. It goes so fast you can't differentiate between characters, but you do it so, I mean, you learn it so that you don't have to think about it. You know, you hear it and you just, your fingers are going faster than you could probably type. Anyway, this machine was designed to make it, it was called a stepping maze, because every time the first wheel would turn, it had to turn 26 times before the second wheel would engage, and then that had to turn 26 times before the third wheel engaged. Well, they found out that most of the messages being sent in the U.S. Navy in the South Pacific and the Atlantic were under 250 characters. So the problem with that was they weren't taking full utilization of the machine, and they decided to enhance it or redesign it. And what they did is they used the first 5 rotors for an Enigma-like encryption, and then they used the second 5 rotors to super encipher or re-encipher the message so that it didn't leave a telltale pattern. And that's what made this so much better than Enigma. This machine itself was not retired until 1959, and they did that because it would only go at 55 words a minute. And at that time they were coming on with radio teletype devices with autocode keys, one-time keys, and that were 100 words a minute or 60 words a minute, and these were just too cumbersome to use. The Army retired Sagaba in 1961 for the same reason. NSA told me, and I have no other source, but they have found no evidence that the Germans or the Japanese or the Russians ever exploited the ECM. But that's like putting the the fox in charge of the hen house. They're not going to admit that one of the hens got away. Okay, I've gone over that part. I did this a little backwards. I should have watched my stuff. Okay. Now this is my second passion about the Germans. In 1942, they invented a second cipher machine, but the High Command decided not to take any action on this new invention because they didn't think it was necessary. They didn't realize what was being done to them. It was called the Hitler Mill, or Hitler Mule was the name. Mill is slang for typewriter in both English and German, but there's none left, or very few. Anyway, the new device had 6 rotors on it that were all set variably, either with each message or each day, or they made it much more complex. And it had a winding variable rotor, which I'm going to show you in a picture. This was very advanced for the time. And there it is. If you look at the wheel at the bottom, you can see where the tabs that kick over the 5 or the 6 rotors on top are not straight, so that they all worked at a different speed for each character. And they said that it was surmised that if the Germans had implemented this device in 1942 when they invented it, instead of waiting in 1944 to 1944, the war might have been a lot different, because neither the Brits or the Americans would be able to read the German mail. And the only reason, and another reason for that, is because with Enigma they had a priori knowledge, thanks to the Poles, of how it worked. And then they enhanced on that baseline to make it even better and better to read the German messages. They would have had to start from ground zero with this, and they may never ever have gotten to the point where they could read it backwards. They ordered 11,000 of these. It was called the Schlüsselgerät. I think that means cipher machine, or SG-41, in 1944 to replace Enigma. And it kind of indicates that at that point in time, the Germans realized that Enigma wasn't as secure as they had always thought it was. Otherwise, why build, or go to the expense of building 11,000 new machines? Eventually, only 500 of them were built. And I think, and I've been told this about a lot of different cipher machines, that there's only 3 left in existence, and one of them is at NSA. And the one that we have at NSA is a weather machine, which didn't have a QWERTY keyboard. It only had 10 number keys, and but it worked functionally the same. So that was the big push by the Germans to show that they realized that there was something wrong with Enigma, because by that time it really didn't make much difference if the Germans found out that we were reading their mail, because they were getting defeated on every front in every way. Okay, and beyond that, and this is where I didn't even want to talk much about this. Computers and software algorithms have changed the implementation, but not the function of cryptography. It's still done in the same software rotor world instead of a hardware rotor world. It's still an algorithm, except that in the software algorithms, it's a little easier to, I think, to implement than having to design a piece of hardware with, I just remember, bake-like rotors and a timing that was so precise that it wouldn't lock up or desynchronize on you. So they, with the new cryptography, today in commercial applications, when you're in HTTPS mode, you're using what's called pretty good protection, and that's either a 64-bit, 128-bit, or 256-bit variable. And they call it pretty good protection, but it's not. It's very good protection, because what you want to protect in codes and ciphers is perishable information. That's information that if you get it right now, it's actionable intelligence, and you can take action to counteract whatever that message said. If you cannot break that message until after the perishable time period, then it's overcome by events, and whether you break it or not, you only get minimal intelligence out of it, because you can't do anything to counteract that particular message. And that's about all I know.